The manifest said 400 tons. It said 12 crew. It said unarmed. Ambassador Vel Sarath of the Hegemony read the manifest 3 times, the way a careful man checks a bridge before he trusts it with his weight. He set it down. He picked it up. He read it once more. Then he placed it flat on the desk and put both hands on it, as if the numbers might change if he let go. 400 tons, 12 crew, unarmed. He had arranged 14 warships in the docking formation outside Conclave Station Velmora. Not because he needed 14 warships to receive 1 human transport. He needed exactly 0 warships for that. But 14 felt like a message. 14 felt like the kind of number that settled into a species' memory and lived there. The humans would count them. They always counted. That was the point. Vel Sarath smoothed his robes, stood from his desk, and walked to the viewport of his receiving chamber. The docking bays stretched below him like a map of everything he controlled. Berth 7 Gamma sat at the far end, newly cleared, the decking crew still dragging their equipment carts off to the sides. It was rated for 600 tons at maximum, a generous margin. Humans built small, efficient things. It was one of the things he had always found quietly charming about them. This stubborn insistence on doing more with less, as if they were still compensating for something. They were still compensating for something, he supposed. 40 years in the Conclave's outer ring would do that to a species. His aide, a thin young Verath named Oris, appeared at his elbow with a data slate and the posture of someone about to say something nobody wanted to hear. Transit ping, Ambassador. The human vessel is 6 hours out. Good. Their response to our hailing carried a single line of text. Read it. Oris read it. Confirmed. UN's unconditional surrender inbound. Berth 7 Gamma. ETA 0631. We'll see you then. That's all. Vel Sarath turned the ship name over in his mind. A strange name. Humans gave their ships strange names. Names that meant things. Names that pointed at old wounds. He had studied human naval tradition once, briefly, in the context of a policy paper no one had read. He remembered thinking the naming convention was almost poetic, in the way that old scars were almost beautiful. He thought nothing particular of the name now. He thought, 6 hours. Good. Time to prepare the remarks. The formal censure document sat on his desk beside the manifest. 22 pages of careful language about humanity's obligations to the galactic community, their pattern of non-compliance with conclave resource-sharing protocols, their failure to integrate meaningfully into the broader trade framework. It was a good document. He had worked on it for 3 months. The language was precise and final, and the tone was the diplomatic equivalent of a door closing on someone's fingers. Vel Sarath was good at his job. He went to prepare his remarks. The transit alarm sounded at 0631, not the soft double chime of a standard arrival. The full alarm, the one calibrated to register atmospheric displacement caused by large mass exit events, the one that had not sounded on Velmora in 11 years. Not since the Kareth military exercises of 2304, when a destroyer had dropped out of transit 3 kilometers closer to the station than the safety protocol permitted. Vel Sarath was still in his receiving chamber. He heard it through the walls. He was not a man who moved fast. Fast movement was undignified, and dignity was armor. He moved fast. In the sensor control hub 3 corridors away, the mass reading came through on the primary display. The operator, a conclave civilian, a woman named Set who had worked station sensors for 19 years without incident, looked at the number, looked at the unit of measurement, looked at the number again. She recalibrated the sensor array, standard procedure when readings fell outside expected parameters. The number changed. It got larger. She recalibrated again. Senior operator, said the man beside her. I see it. That's not, I see it. She opened a channel to the docking authority. Then she opened a second channel, simultaneously, to the hegemony warship formation. Then, because the number was still sitting there on her screen, large and wrong and completely indifferent to her discomfort, she opened a third channel to Ambassador Vel Sarath's office. She said, Sir, you should come to the sensor hub. On the private command channel shared by the 14 hegemony warship captains, nobody said anything for 11 seconds. This requires context. The hegemony species spoke at roughly 3 times the conversational rate of humans. 11 seconds of silence among them was the equivalent of a human staring at a wall for half a minute with their mouth open. It was a geological silence. It was the silence of people who had lost a word they needed. Captain Veth of the destroyer Rightful Order was the first to speak. She said, that reading. Nobody responded. She said, someone confirm that reading. Captain Orath of the cruiser Sovereign Claim said, very quietly, it's confirmed. Another silence. Shorter this time, 7 seconds. What is the protocol? said a third captain, one of the younger ones, for a civilian transport vessel that has a mass signature of... It is not a civilian transport vessel, said Veth. No. The manifest says... The manifest, said Veth, is wrong. A long pause. What do we do? Veth looked at her tactical display. The incoming vessel was following a standard transit approach corridor. It had filed the correct entry notification. It was reducing speed at the correct rate for a standard docking approach. Every procedural box had been ticked. Every protocol was being honored to the letter. Whatever this ship was, it was following the rules. She said, "We hold position." Because what else were they going to do? The unconditional surrender dropped out of transit at 0631, on the mark. It did not arrive. That is not the right word. Arrivals are gradual things that approach, things you see coming. This was more like a geographic feature. One moment the space at the mouth of Berth 7 Gamma's approach corridor was empty. The next moment, something was occupying it that had not been there before. 14 kilometers of it. The hull was plated in a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so the ship read against the stars not as a shape but as an absence. A place where the stars stopped. The rail batteries ran from bow to stern in 8 parallel rows, each barrel longer than most hegemony vessels. The sensor arrays at the bow were larger than the hegemony destroyer rightful order in its entirety. The drive wake alone, the residual heat and radiation from the transit cores, made the station's structural dampeners activate for the first time in 6 years. In the sensor hub, Operator Set sat very still and watched her instruments. The mass reading was stable now. 847,000 tons. She had a very specific thought, which was, I have never been in the same solar system as something this large that was not a planet. She did not say this out loud. She was a professional. On the bridge of the unconditional surrender, Commander Yael Duras finished her tea. She had poured it when the transit countdown reached 2 minutes. She drank it slowly, looking at nothing in particular, one hand loose on the armrest of the command chair, the other wrapped around the cup. When the cup was empty, she set it in the small holder built into the armrest for exactly this purpose, and picked up the tablet that held the Conclave's summons document. She read it. Not for the first time. She had read it 17 times in the past 3 weeks, which was not a compulsive thing but a precise thing. She read it until she knew every word, not because the words were complicated but because she believed in knowing exactly what someone had said to her before she said anything back. The summons was polite. It was also the diplomatic equivalent of a leash being held out in front of a dog that was expected to walk into it. She set the tablet down. "Hailing frequencies from the station," said her communications officer. "I'll take it." The channel opened. Ambassador Velsareth's voice came through. He had a good voice, deep, controlled, the voice of a man who had practiced what to do with his voice. He began his remarks. Velsareth had prepared 3 pages of remarks, and he delivered all 3 pages, because he was the kind of man who committed to things. Duras listened. She waited for him to finish. She said, "Thank you, Ambassador. We're beginning standard docking approach. Can Berth 7 Gamma accommodate our tonnage?" A pause. A specific kind of pause. The kind that happens when someone who has spent 30 years never being caught off guard gets caught off guard. "Our berths," said Velsareth, "are rated for." "Right," said Duras. "We'll make it work." She nodded at her helmsman. He was already moving. The approach had been calculated before they left. It had been calculated before the summons even arrived, actually, back when the Conclave's communications to Earth had started carrying a particular tone that warranted preparation. The unconditional surrender began its docking approach. Standard velocity. Standard corridor. Every protocol observed, every safety parameter met, every form that needed filing already filed in triplicate 2 hours ago. The station's structural integrity system registered the vessel's gravitational interaction with the docking frame and sent a priority notification to the engineering team. Not an alarm. Not exactly. More of a consultation request. A suggestion that certain members of the engineering team might want to be aware of certain load calculations that were about to become relevant. The engineering team became aware. In the docking bay below, the deck crew who had finished clearing the area for a 400-ton transport stood at the edge of the bay and looked up at the thing coming toward them and stood very still. Berth 7 Gamma was going to be fine. The math worked out. The unconditional surrender's docking struts were designed for station contacts exactly like this one, rated to 12 times the load they would actually impose. The approach was precise to within centimeters. The computer handling the docking had run this calculation 43,000 times in simulation. It was not worried. But Berth 7 Gamma now had an extension that had not existed on any chart an hour ago. A zone of occupied space that had been empty space then, and was not empty now. The station logged it as Berth 7 Gamma extended. There was no other logical category. Velsarath stood at his viewport and watched the hull plate of the unconditional surrender slide past. It took 3 minutes for the length of the ship to clear his window at approach velocity. He stood there the whole time. His aide Oris stood beside him. At some point Oris said very quietly, "The manifest." "I know." 400 tons. "I know." "It's 41 years old," said Oris. "The hull commission date." "I ran the registry. This ship is 41 years old." Velsarath said nothing. "They've had this," said Oris, "for 41 years. The hull plate kept moving past the viewport. The rail batteries, seen up close, were each wider than a corridor. The armor plating had no seams he could see, just a continuous dark surface that drank light and gave nothing back. 41 years. Velsarath picked up the censure document from his desk. He held it for a moment. He set it down. He did not pick it up again. Outside, the last section of hull passed the viewport, and the docking locks engaged with a sound that moved through the station's bones, deep and final, like something being decided. He turned away from the window. "Get me the inspection team," he said, "and open a channel to the bridge." He needed to say something. He just had not yet worked out what. The channel was open for 4 seconds before Velsarath found words. In 30 years of diplomatic work, he had never needed 4 seconds. He had once talked his way through a trade summit that collapsed at the opening handshake. He had once delivered a formal censure to the Karath Confederation's War Council and made it sound like a compliment. He was a man built for exactly these moments. Moments where the ground shifted and lesser diplomats went quiet, and he did not. 4 seconds. He said, "Commander, the Conclave welcomes the vessel of the Terran Republic to Velmora Station." From the bridge of the unconditional surrender, Commander Duras said, "Thank you, Ambassador." 2 words. Not "we're honored," or "the Republic extends its greetings," or any of the standard return phrases that 30 years of these exchanges had trained him to expect. Just, "Thank you." The way you thank someone who held a door. He pressed on. He was a professional. "This is, of course, a routine port call, as indicated in our formal summons, and we look forward to—" "Of course," said Duras. Again, 2 words. The agreement of someone whose attention was on other things. He heard, very faintly in the background of the channel, another voice on her bridge saying something about the portside docking locks. Heard her respond without turning from the channel, 2 quick words, and then she was back to him and nothing on her end had changed. Her voice was the same temperature throughout. Not cold, not warm. The temperature of a room where the thermostat has been set correctly and left alone. "I'll come to the docking reception in 1 hour," she said. "Is that acceptable?" "Yes, we will." "Good." She paused. "Your ships are sitting on my starboard sensor array." He had nothing prepared for this. "The escort formation is standard. The Karath-class ones. 3 of them. They're in my sensor shadow. I'll need them moved before I can file the arrival telemetry." Velsarath turned to look at Oris. Oris was already on a secondary channel, relaying the request to the formation. "Consider it done," said Velsarath. "Thank you," said Duras. And the channel closed. He stood for a moment. His hands were folded in front of him, which was his default posture, the one he used when he wanted to look like a man who was deciding something rather than a man who was trying to remember how to breathe. He said, "Get me everything on that ship." On the bridge of the unconditional surrender, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Maki was at the sensor console. This was not his assigned station. His assigned station was the XO's chair, port side of command, where he was supposed to sit and manage the ship's administrative functions while the commander handled contact. Maki was regularly not at his assigned station. This was a well-known quality of Maki's that had been noted in 3 consecutive performance reviews, always in the same careful language. Lieutenant Commander Maki demonstrates significant initiative in personally monitoring departmental functions. Nobody had told him to stop. This was partly because he was very good at it, and partly because the one time Commander Duras had asked him to explain himself, he had said, "I learned things at the console that don't make it into the reports, Commander." She had looked at him for a moment and gone back to what she was doing. He had been at the console ever since. Right now he was looking at the 14 hegemony warships in the formation outside. He was doing this in the way that a mechanic looks at old cars at a show, with genuine interest, mild nostalgia for a design philosophy that had peaked and passed, and a very specific private sorrow about the depreciation. "Karath class," he said to no one in particular. 3 of them in the far cluster. He scrolled the display. They haven't updated the targeting cores since the third expansion, the original fire control architecture, which is, it's a real design philosophy that, lock something good and leave it alone. A pause. Doesn't work past a certain point, but you can admire the commitment. He scrolled further. The lead vessel has a micro-fracture in the port-aft shield emitter, running hot on the secondary coil. They've got maybe 6 months before that becomes an unscheduled maintenance issue. The sensor officer beside him, a young lieutenant named Park, said, "Should I log that?" Maki considered. "Put it in the observation file. Flag it low priority." He scrolled again. "The other 13 are fine." He said this the way you say the other 13 are fine. Not impressed, not dismissive, just noting a fact. Park entered the observation. "The big cruiser," said Maki. "Second row, center. That's a sovereign mandate class. Newer design. Decent energy to mass ratio." He tilted his head slightly. "Still using magnetic field compression for the main array though. 6 years out of date. The hegemony updates their weapon systems on a 50-year cycle." He paused. "We're on a 7-year cycle." Park said nothing. Maki scrolled again. Duras from the command chair said, "Maki. Commander. Stop narrating. I'm observing." Aloud. A pause. "I'll observe quietly." He kept scrolling. The docking reception was held in Bay 7 Gamma's secondary receiving chamber, which was a room built for import inspectors and cargo manifests and had not seen diplomatic use in its operating life. It smelled like equipment grease and someone's lunch from 3 hours ago. The conclave delegation had set up a table and 2 chairs. Velsarath had arranged himself at one side. He had his prepared remarks, his censure document, and 22 pages of careful language about obligations and integration frameworks. Duras walked in. She was wearing her duty uniform, not dress blues. This was, in diplomatic protocol, roughly equivalent to showing up to a formal dinner in work clothes. It was either a statement or an oversight, and nothing about Duras suggested oversight. She sat down. Velsarath began. He had prepared 3 pages of opening remarks, and he delivered them because he was a professional, and because the alternative, stopping midway through because the person across from him had the specific quality of someone whose attention was already past this moment, was not something he was willing to do. Duras listened. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady on him and no expression that he could read, which was its own expression if you knew how to read it. He did not, quite. He had studied human face reading. He thought he was good at it. She was listening the way you listen to a weather report about weather you've already looked out the window at. He finished. She said, "The conclave's position on resource-sharing protocols is noted." He waited. She said nothing else. He said, "The conclave has concerns, Commander, about the Republic's continued. The Republic filed a formal response to those concerns 14 months ago, through the standard channel. Did it arrive?" A pause. "There was a processing delay in the administrative." "It arrived," said Duras. "Not an accusation, a correction. We have the delivery confirmation. Do you want me to pull it up?" He did not. She did not pull it up. He shifted direction. He was good at this, reading the gradient of a conversation and tilting it. He said, "There is also the matter of this vessel." For the first time, something crossed Duras's face. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "What about it?" She said. "The manifest," said Velsarath, "listed a cargo transport. The manifest listed the vessel registered to this berth assignment, yes. That is not a cargo transport. No. This." He stopped, started again. "The conclave's summons was directed to a diplomatic transport. Standard procedure for a port call of this nature calls for..." "A vessel," said Duras. "The summons called for a vessel. We sent a vessel." She looked at him for a moment. "We sent our vessel." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere deep in the station's infrastructure, the structural integrity system was having a very detailed conversation with the engineering team about load-bearing calculations and what certain numbers meant for certain components over extended docking periods. It was a quiet conversation, technical. None of it reached this room. Velsarath said, "Why this one?" It came out before he'd planned it. He had not planned to ask. He had planned to redirect, to return to his censure document, to control the conversation back to the frame he had built for it. But the question was already out and he couldn't recover it. Duras looked at him. She said, "Because you asked." A pause. "You sent a summons. We answered it. We answered it with the truth of what we are." She put her hands together on the table, an easy gesture, unhurried. "You've been meeting cargo transports for 40 years, 12 crew, 400 tons, a beat. We thought it was time for an honest conversation. He sat with that. Outside, the 14 hegemony warships held their formation. Vel-Sarath was aware of them in the background of his thoughts, the way you are aware of something you brought to a situation that turned out to be the wrong thing to bring. He said, carefully, "Your escort ships." "We don't have escort ships," said Duras. A pause. "We came alone," she said. He let the silence hold for 3 seconds. "I noticed you're 14, she said. One time, quietly, and moved on. When would it be convenient to schedule the inspection? Later, walking back to his receiving chamber, Vel-Sarath passed Oris in the corridor. Oris fell into step beside him. How was the reception? Vel-Sarath walked for a moment before answering. Get me, he said, the complete list of every vessel in the human naval registry, not the public registry, the actual registry, whatever our intelligence division has. Oris said, that will take time. I know. Some of those records will be sealed. I know. Do you think, said Oris carefully, that there are other ships like this one? Vel-Sarath thought about a woman who had listened to 3 pages of prepared remarks with the patience of someone who had been patient for a very long time about a great many things. He thought about the word honestly. He thought about 41 years. Get the registry, he said. He walked on. Oris did not follow. He had calls to make. Down in Bay 7 Gamma, the docking locks held the unconditional surrender, with the mechanical certainty of something that had been built for a moment, exactly like this one, and the station made small sounds around it as it adjusted to the weight, the way old wood adjusts to new furniture, quietly, without complaint, because it had no other option. The inspection request came through at 0900, filed correctly, citing Article 14 of the Galactic Transit Compact, the standard treaty clause that gave any signatory nation the right to inspect vessels docked at a shared port. Commander Duras read it, forwarded it to the docking liaison with a single line of instruction, assign an escort, full access, standard protocol. The docking liaison forwarded it to the duty roster. The duty roster, after a certain logic of its own, assigned Specialist 3rd Class Amara Okafor. Okafor read the assignment at 0912, which was 4 minutes into her first break of the day. She was eating a protein bar. She read the assignment, looked at the time, and ate the last third of the protein bar in one bite. She had been hoping for 20 minutes. She got 4. She had been on the unconditional surrender for 4 years. She was 23 years old. She had stopped being surprised by this ship approximately 3 years and 11 months ago, which meant she had been surprised by it for exactly 1 month, before it became simply the place where she worked. Now it was the place where she worked. The corridors were the corridors. The ship was the ship. It was very large. She knew every maintenance route from Bay 7 to Engineering Deck 3, and which of the corridor lights on Level 6 flickered when the secondary power coupling ran a diagnostic. She went to meet the inspection delegation at the docking collar at 0920. The delegation was 12 hegemony officials, 3 conclave observers, and 1 military attaché with a bright new notepad who had the posture of someone who expected to fill it. Okafor looked at them. They looked at her. She said, I'm your escort. Stay together. Don't touch anything marked with a red border. And keep up. Any questions? One of the conclave observers said, Are there? How long will this? 2 hours, said Okafor. Maybe less if we move. She turned and walked. They followed. This was partly because she was the escort, and partly because the alternative was standing at the docking collar indefinitely, and the docking collar smelled like coolant fluid and recycled air, and had nothing interesting in it. The first corridor stopped them. Not stopped them physically. It was a wide corridor. It fit all 16 of them with room. The issue was that a hegemony destroyer's bridge, the full bridge, the operational center of the whole vessel, was narrower than this corridor by roughly 4 meters. The attaché with the notepad measured this visually, the way you measure something you don't want to write down because writing it down makes it too real. He wrote it down. Okafor kept walking. They passed a window that looked into a secondary operations room. Through the glass, a crew of 8 humans sat at consoles running what appeared to be standard navigation maintenance. The room was large. The crew was small in it, the way individual workers are small in large factories, correctly sized for the work, not for the space around them. How large is the full crew? One of the hegemony officials asked. 4,200, said Okafor. A pause. She kept walking. That's for a vessel of this. The official stopped, recalibrated. That seems like a small crew for a vessel of this scale. We're big on automation, said Okafor. She did not explain what she meant by this. They came to the weapons bay. The door was standard height, standard width. Everything past it was not. The bay ran for 2 kilometers in a straight line. The rail battery emplacements, each one a dense mechanical assembly of coils and accelerator rings and targeting hardware, were mounted in rows on both sides of the bay, 40 meters apart from each other, running the full length of the space. The ceiling was 30 meters up. The lighting was even and functional, and showed every detail of every emplacement with the clarity of a room that had nothing to hide. The military attaché began counting. He held his notepad, and he counted from the door, working forward. He was a methodical man. He did this well. He counted 10 emplacements, made a note, counted 10 more, made a note. At 60 he stopped writing. There were more. He could see them. They went on. The bay curved slightly with the hull at this point, and the far end of the row was not visible, but the emplacements he could see made 60 look like a beginning. He had come here expecting to see weapons, and he had no reference point for what he was looking at, because the largest vessel in the hegemony fleet carried 14 such emplacements, and was considered heavily armed. He held the notepad. He did not write anything. Okafor waited for them at the far door, weight on one heel, looking at the time. "Anything else?" she said. Nobody said anything. "Reactor section next," she said. The reactor section was reached through a corridor that passed 7 sealed doors, each one marked with the standard human hazard indicators: radiation, pressure, magnetic field strength. The indicators were routine. They were the same ones used on every human vessel. The numbers on them were not routine. Not to anyone who knew what the numbers meant. One of the conclave observers was a scientist. She had spent her career studying propulsion systems. She read the numbers on the 3rd door and then stood very still for a moment, and then kept walking, because Okafor was already 10 meters ahead, and stopping meant being left behind. The reactor room was divided into sections, each housing a drive core, and Okafor pointed at them the way a tour guide points at paintings that have been there so long they've become wallpaper. 7 independent drive cores, she said. Each one runs independently. If 6 go offline, the ship can operate on 1. If all 7 are running together, we can reach, she said a number, a transit speed. Standard cruising uses 3. The scientist said, each of those cores individually. Yeah. One of them individually could. The power output alone could power a mid-sized station. Yeah. Okafor gestured at the wall. We use them for going places. They passed a door. The door was standard-sized, gray. It had a label on it. Auxiliary Systems. The conclave observer, who was not a scientist, a political officer named Desh, who had worked conclave administration for 20 years, stopped in front of it. What is auxiliary? He said. Backup, said Okafor. He looked at the door. He looked at the reactor room they had just come through. He looked at the door, again. This, he said, pointing at the door, is the backup. Yeah. He made a sound that was not a word but communicated something. Okafor had heard this sound before. She waited for it to pass. It always passed. Then she moved on. Compartment 14G was on the exterior hull section, reached by an elevator that dropped 40 levels in 11 seconds. The hegemony scientist, the propulsion specialist, had been quiet since the reactor room, walking with the careful attention of someone who was looking at everything very hard and saying nothing about what they were finding. In compartment 14G, she stopped. There was a series of installations along the outer hull, dense arrays of tracking mechanisms and short barrel launch configurations, evenly spaced, running fore to aft. She had not seen this design before. She was familiar with most military hull configurations in the conclave and hegemony databases, the ones that were accessible to someone with her security clearance. This was not in the databases. She stepped out of the group. Specialist, she said. Okafor looked. This system, what is it? Okafor looked at where she was pointing. Point defense, she said. Relativistic kinetic intercept. The scientist processed this. You're intercepting kinetic weapons, she said. Incoming. Yeah. At relativistic velocities. Anything slower isn't really a threat, said Okafor. The scientist stood very still. She had theoretical models. Her institution had done the math on relativistic kinetic weapons, the energy requirements for launch, the targeting problems involved in intercept, the engineering demands of a system that could reliably track something moving at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light and place something in its path in the relevant window of time. The math worked out on paper. The math had always worked out on paper. She looked at the array. When, she said. When was this developed? Okafor said. I'm not sure I have that date available. Approximately. I've been on this ship 4 years and it was already standard when I arrived. A pause. You'd want to ask engineering. The scientist rejoined the group. She did not say anything else for the remainder of the inspection. The War Archive was the last room on the manifest. It was a corridor, technically. A wide one, 30 meters deep, with both long walls and the ceiling all serving as display surfaces. The entries ran chronologically from left to right. Each one listed: conflict name, theater, dates, scale, participants, resolution. Okafor opened the door and stood aside. The delegation went in. It took them a moment to understand what they were looking at. Then it took them another moment to understand the scale. Then the military attaché, who had put his notepad away somewhere around the weapons bay and not taken it out again, stood at the entrance and looked at the far end of the corridor and understood that the display did not end at the far end of the corridor. The display went around the corner. He walked to the corner. It went around the next corner. The hegemony had 3 wars in their history. The Conclave's oldest member species had 2. These were considered significant. These had shaped foreign policy, reformed governments, defined the modern era. The display had been running for 30 meters before it reached anything a Conclave historian would recognize as recent history. Desch, the political officer, found his nation's 3 wars in a subsection that read, in clean standard text, minor regional conflicts, external species, 1700-2200 standard. He stood in front of this. He stood there long enough that Okafor came to find him. "We need to move," she said. He pointed at the label. She looked at it. "Is that," he said, "how you classify?" "The archive is organized by scale," said Okafor. "That section covers conflicts under a certain threshold." He looked at the label again. He said nothing. "Photos are fine," said Okafor, "if you want." Nobody took photos. In the far section, the elderly Conclave historian had stopped in front of a single entry. A small conflict, one she had never heard of. The dates were old, pre-Conclave contact. The listed casualties on the human side were 30,000. In her 30 years of historical work, a 30,000 casualty event was the kind of thing that defined an era. It was a civilizational scar. It was the thing that went into textbooks. She had written 3 papers about the psychological impact of casualty events at that scale on post-conflict societies. She stood in front of this entry. She read the surrounding entries. Similar numbers, larger numbers, smaller numbers, running in both directions, date by date, conflict by conflict, the way a road runs, not ending, just going further than you'd thought. "Specialist," she said. Okafor came. "How long," said the historian, "does this archive go?" Okafor thought about it. "The full archive covers human military history from the earliest recorded organized conflict," she said. "The accessible section here is an index. The full records are in the ship's historical database." A pause. "It's a significant database." The historian looked at the wall. She said, "How did you—" She stopped. Started again. "How did your species," she said, "survive?" Okafor looked at her. There was something in the question. Not challenge, not aggression, just genuine puzzlement. The kind that comes when you're looking at something that doesn't fit any framework you have, and you're trying to find one that works. Okafor said, "We're pretty stubborn." She said it flat, not proud, not humble, just a fact. The way you state a fact about weather or materials or the load-bearing capacity of a floor. Then she told the delegation they needed to move. They had one more room, and then the inspection was complete, and she had paperwork to file before the end of her shift. They followed her out. In the corridor, the historian walked in the middle of the group and did not look at anything in particular. She was thinking very hard about stubbornness and what it cost and what it made, and she thought about this all the way back to the docking collar and for several hours after, in the quiet of her quarters on the station where she had lived for 12 years, and which had never felt so small until today. The request for a private meeting came from Vel Sarath. This surprised no one on Duras's staff, because they had all been on this ship long enough to know what the inspection tended to produce. It produced questions. Not the formal ones, not the procedural ones, but the other kind. The ones that showed up in the faces of the people who came aboard and worked their way through the corridors and the weapons bay and the reactor section and came out the other end looking like they had been walking through something and had not quite finished yet. Those people always wanted a private meeting. Duras took it alone. No aides, no staff, no record being kept. She told her XO this, and Maki looked at her for one moment, with the expression he used when he thought something was inadvisable, but had made peace with the fact that his opinion had not been requested. Then he went back to the sensor console. She brought the tea herself. The room she chose was not the official diplomatic receiving area on Deck 4. It was a smaller briefing room on Deck 7, used by her navigation team for shift handovers. 2 chairs, 1 table, a viewport that looked out at the station's underbelly rather than the main approach. The kind of room where people sat to work through problems, not to impress anyone. Vel Sarath arrived on time. He looked at the room. He looked at the tea. He sat down. Duras poured his cup first, then her own. She set the pot between them and did not say anything, which is itself a kind of courtesy, the courtesy of letting someone take their time when they are clearly working out where to begin. He needed some time. Your inspection team reported to me an hour ago, he said. I assumed they would. They were. He stopped. The historian, she asked me something. She asked me how your species survived. Duras drank her tea. What did you tell her? I told her I intended to ask you that directly. Duras looked at him across the table. Something in her face shifted. Not much, just a degree or two, the way a door opens a small amount without opening fully. We're not sure ourselves, she said. Honestly, if you look at the math, we shouldn't have made it past a certain point in our own history. The weapons, the diseases, the things we did to each other and to our own planet. She looked at the viewport for a moment. But we did. And somewhere in that, something got built. A reflex, maybe. For surviving things that should have ended us. The ship, said Vel Sarath. The ship. Yes. Why build it? The question hung there. He had been planning it since the manifest came through. The first version of it. He had rebuilt the question 17 times since then, trying to find the framing that would get him past whatever answer was prepared. He had settled on the simplest version, because the simplest version was hardest to deflect. Duras thought about it for a genuine moment. He could see her doing it. Not performing consideration, actually doing it. Looking at the question and finding the honest place. She said, because we've always lived in a universe that wanted to end us. Before we ever left our planet, before we ever met anyone else, the universe was already trying, and we learned something from that. We learned to be thorough. She set her cup down. We're not aggressive, Ambassador, I want to be clear about that. We don't go looking for conflict, but we are prepared, thoroughly, in the way that something survives for a long time by making absolutely certain it can survive the next thing. A pause. The unconditional surrender is not a threat, it's a proof. It proves that we took the possibility of threat seriously enough to answer it before it arrived. Vel Sarath turned his cup slowly on the table. 41 years, he said. Yes. You had this ship for 41 years. Yes. And in that time, he said, you attended conclave sessions in cargo transports. 12 crew. 400 tons. He looked at her. You sat at the outer ring table in sessions where the hegemony voted down your trade proposals, and the conclave delayed your membership application, and the resource-sharing protocol specifically designed by 3 members to disadvantage Republic interests went through on a standing vote. A pause. You did all of that, with this ship in your registry. Duras looked at him for a long moment. We were waiting, she said, to be asked. The room was very quiet. Through the viewport, the station's underbelly, pipes, maintenance conduits, structural supports, ran in the utilitarian geometry of things built to hold other things up. A maintenance pod moved along one of the conduits, small and slow, doing its particular job. Asked, said Vel Sarath. For an honest meeting, said Duras. To talk as what we actually are to what you actually are. She looked at him steadily. Your summons was the first formal invitation we'd received in a decade, so we came. And we came honestly. He looked at the table. He looked at his tea. He said, what does humanity want? Duras reached into the inner pocket of her duty jacket. She took out a folded document, actual paper, not a data slate, which was already unusual in an age when paper was an aesthetic choice rather than a practical one. She unfolded it once, placed it on the table, and slid it across to him. He picked it up. It was a single page. The conclave's own administrative header was at the top, printed in the standard format, the seal embossed with a precision that meant it had been done when the document was first created, not copied later. The text below it was a formal application. Full conclave membership for the Terran Republic. He looked at the filing date. 14 years ago. He had been on the conclave's administrative board 14 years ago. He remembered that year specifically because they had restructured the resource-sharing protocol. He remembered the sessions. He remembered the vote. He did not remember this document. The processing queue, he said. Was very long, said Duras. Yes. Administrative backlogs. We have the delivery confirmation, she said. 14 years of them. We filed this application every year for 14 years, Ambassador. Every year, on the same date, through the correct channel, with the correct documentation. Every year we received an automated confirmation that it had been received and was being processed. She took a sip of her tea. We kept copies. He held the document. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. Not much. Enough. The kind of yellowing that happens when something is kept carefully in proper storage for a long time, taken out occasionally, confirmed to still be what it is, put back. She said, "A fair seat at the table, the same one every other member species got. That's all we want." He looked at the document. He looked at her. He said, very carefully, "There will be members who resist. I know." The hegemony, specifically. "I know," she said. "I assume your 14 captains are still in formation outside." A silence. "They are," he said. "You noticed," she said, "that we came alone." It was not a question. He said, "Yes. No escort, no formation. One vessel." She looked at the viewport. One vessel that has not raised its shields once since we arrived. Once. She let that sit for the length of one breath. Then she moved on. "We're not here to frighten anyone," she said. "We're here because you asked, and because it was time to have a conversation that was," she found the word, "proportionate to what we actually are to each other." The tea was cooling. Outside, the maintenance pod had moved further along its conduit, going about its business, indifferent to the things being decided in a small briefing room 2 decks above it. Velsarath looked at the document in his hands. 14 years, paper kept in a file, the slight yellowing. Someone had printed this, and put it away, and maintained the file, and added to it every year. A new confirmation, a new date, a new proof that the question was still being asked, even though no one was answering. He found, sitting there, that he was very tired. Not physically tired, the other kind, the kind that comes when you've been very certain about a situation for a long time, and the situation has, quietly and without asking your permission, become something else. He said, "If I present this to the conclave." "When?" said Duras, very gently. A pause. "When?" he said. "Yes. There will be a fight. I imagine so. The hegemony will spend political capital to block it. 3 other members have specific objections they will raise. The session will be, I imagine," said Duras, "that it will be very difficult, and that you will have to work hard, and that some of those relationships will be complicated afterward." She looked at him. "We've been waiting 14 years. We can wait for you to do the work." He sat with that. It was not patience exactly, in the way he understood patience. He had negotiated with species who were patient, who counted time in long arcs, and were genuinely unbothered by waiting because waiting was simply time, and they had plenty of it. This was something different. This was patience with weight behind it. The patience of something that had chosen to wait when it did not have to. That was its own kind of statement. He looked at the document once more. Then he folded it. Carefully, along the original creases, held it in both hands. "I cannot promise," he said, "what the vote will be." "No," she said, "but I think you know what the right vote is." He said nothing. She did not push. She refilled his cup. They sat for a while, not talking, in the briefing room on Deck 7 with the viewport showing the station's working underside and the cooling tea between them, and outside 14 warships held a formation that was beginning, in a way that had no formal language yet, to feel like the wrong formation for the current situation. Velsarath left 20 minutes later. He walked back to his receiving chamber without Oris, without staff, carrying the folded document in one hand at his side. He passed the sensor hub on the way. Through the window he could see Operator Set at her station. She was looking at her instruments. On her main display, the mass reading of the unconditional surrender was still there, stable and precise, the same number it had been since arrival. 847,000 tons. He kept walking. In his chamber, he sat at his desk. He placed the folded document in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened his communication terminal and sent a summons for the senior conclave session chair. He had a very long conversation ahead of him. He began working out, in the careful and practiced way of a man who had spent 30 years being the most prepared person in any given room, what he was going to say. The document sat on the desk in front of him while he worked. He did not put it away. The conclave emergency session was called for 0800 and ran until 1900. 11 hours. The session chamber on Velmora was circular, as all conclave chambers were. A design choice from the organization's founding that was meant to represent equality. The idea that every seat was the same distance from the center, that no one sat at the head of a table because there was no head. 7 species at 7 curved tables, each facing inward. It was a good design. Vel-Sarath had always admired it. He arrived at 0750. He had been awake since 0300. He had the document, the original one, the slightly yellowed paper, in a case beside his other materials. He did not know if he would use it. He had prepared his remarks without it. He had prepared his remarks 4 times between 0300 and 0750, each time finding a new problem with the previous version, each time starting over. The final version was shorter than the first by 2/3. He had learned, over 30 years, that shorter was almost always better. He sat down. Around him, the other 6 delegations arrived. The hegemony's 3 representatives came in together and did not look at him, which told him the conversation he had expected to have yesterday had already happened on their end. The Karath Confederation's delegate, an older woman named Suvir who had been in this chamber for longer than any of them, came in last and looked at Vel-Sarath once, briefly, in a way that communicated nothing specific and everything general. The session chair called the meeting to order. The formal agenda item was listed as Review of Pending Applications, Terran Republic Status Determination. The session chair read it aloud. It was the first time in 14 years it had been read aloud in a full session. It had been deferred 14 times. Not voted down, deferred, a bureaucratic mechanism that required far less political energy than a formal rejection while achieving the same result. Nobody had ever been forced to say no. They had just kept saying, not yet. The hegemony's lead representative spoke first. His name was Orath Min, and he was a careful man in the way that architects of narrow corridors are careful, very deliberate about where he left room and where he didn't. He cited the resource-sharing protocol imbalances. He cited the Republic's non-participation in 4 conclave trade frameworks over the past decade. He cited strategic positioning concerns that were clearly worded but relied on everyone in the room not asking too specifically what they meant. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was good at it. Vel-Sarath listened to all 40 minutes and noted the places where the argument was solid and the places where it was the diplomatic equivalent of a wall with a very nice finish hiding a structural crack. Then he spoke. He spoke for 22 minutes. He did not argue that the humans were harmless. He did not claim they had no capability for force, or that the unconditional surrender was something other than what it was. Orath Min had built his 40 minutes partly on the assumption that anyone supporting the Republic would have to explain the ship away, and Vel-Sarath had no intention of explaining it away. He said, 7 days ago the Conclave sent a summons to the Terran Republic requiring a vessel to report to Velmora for a diplomatic port call. The purpose of that summons, as everyone in this room knows, was not diplomatic exchange. The purpose was demonstration. We wanted them to arrive in a way that reminded them of their position. He looked around the chamber. They sent us a ship that is 14 kilometers long, 847,000 tons displacement, a vessel that we now know to be 41 years old, built and maintained and crewed for 41 years without a word to anyone in this body. He paused. I spent those 41 years negotiating with human representatives, who came to this station in 400-ton cargo transports with 12 crew. I spent those years applying institutional pressure with the comfortable assumption that I understood who I was applying it to. He looked at his table. I was wrong about that. The chamber was quiet. Here is what was not wrong, he said. The Republic's application, which has been in our processing queue for 14 years, which was filed correctly, which meets every criteria for consideration, which, he stopped. I found the delivery confirmations, 14 years of them. They sent this application every year. They received our automated confirmation every year. They kept copies. A pause. They kept copies for 14 years. He reached into the case, took out the document. He did not unfold it. He held it up so the room could see the age of the paper. They came to this meeting in the most powerful vessel any of us has ever seen, that any of us knew existed. They followed every docking protocol. They filed every form. They submitted to a full treaty inspection with complete cooperation. They requested a fair conversation. He set the document down. And they brought this, a 14-year-old application, filed correctly, filed annually, never acted upon. He looked at Orath Min. He looked at Orath Min. The hegemony has expressed concerns about strategic positioning. I understand those concerns. I shared some of them until 3 days ago. He folded his hands. But I have a question for this chamber that is not about strategy. It is about what we are doing here, what the conclave is for. He let the silence hold for 4 seconds. If we cannot extend full membership to a species that has done everything we asked, waited as long as we required, and demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, that they are exactly what they say they are, then what are we requiring? What does a species have to do? He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. The session chair managed the discussion that followed. It was exactly as contentious as Vel-Sarath had expected. Orath Min returned twice to the strategic positioning concerns. The Korath delegate raised 2 procedural objections that were technically valid, but obviously motivated by something other than procedure. And a 4th delegation cited the resource-sharing framework 17 times, in ways that grew increasingly disconnected from the actual question. It went on for 9 hours. Vel-Sarath spoke 3 more times, briefly each time. He had learned that the person who spoke the most in a contested session almost never won it. The vote was called at 1847. 6 in favor. 1 abstention. The motion carried. On the bridge of the unconditional surrender, the ping arrived at 1852. Duras was in the command chair. She had been there for most of the day, working through departmental reports, approving maintenance schedules, reviewing a training evaluation for 3 junior officers who needed to sit their qualification boards in the next 2 months. Standard work, the work that a ship always has regardless of what is happening around it. The ping came through on her personal terminal. She read it. She sat for 4 seconds. Then she set the terminal face down on the armrest and looked at the forward viewport, which showed the interior of Berth 7 Gamma Extended, docking struts, station wall, the unscenic architecture of a place designed for function rather than view. She said, at a volume her bridge crew could hear. The vote passed. That was all she said. The cheer started at the communication station, where her comms officer had been monitoring the session channel and already knew, and it spread across the bridge in the way that things spread when everyone has been waiting and nobody wanted to be the first to say it might not happen. It went into the ship's internal announcement system without her input. Someone hit the all-hands channel because they couldn't help it, and it moved through 14 kilometers of corridors and decks and compartments like something physical, like something with weight, the way a sound becomes a feeling when it travels through enough structure. 4,200 people, 30 seconds of it. She let it run. Then she said, "All right," into the all-hands channel, even and clear. "Well done, prep for departure, we have a schedule." The cheer cut off. Not immediately. There was a natural trailing edge, the way waves have trailing edges after the main swell. But the work started. She could hear it in the change of the ship's ambient sound, the background frequency that shifts when a crew moves from waiting to doing. Maki appeared at her elbow. He had not cheered. He had stood at the sensor console looking at his instruments with the expression of a man who had worked out the likely result 6 hours ago, and was now experiencing the confirmation with controlled satisfaction. He said, "Departure prep at standard timeline, 22 minutes. Good. The formation hasn't moved. They'll move when we do." A pause. Vel-Sarath's office has sent a courtesy communication. Formal. Reply formally. Standard acknowledgement. Tell them we'll be in contact through the proper channels. "The proper channels," said Maki, "will now include a full membership seat." "Yes," said Duras, "they will." She stood up from the command chair, which she did at the end of a watch, not because there was anywhere specific to go, but because standing was a different posture than sitting, and this was a different moment. She looked at the viewport, the docking struts, the station wall, the unscenic architecture. She said quietly, to no one in particular, 23 minutes. Then she went to file the departure clearance herself, which was not her job but which she did sometimes when the paperwork was the kind of paperwork that deserved to be handled with some attention. The unconditional surrender undocked at 1919. It did this in full compliance with every transit protocol on the conclave books. The docking locks released in the correct sequence. The departure velocity was within permitted limits for the berth class. The approach corridor was cleared and filed 40 minutes in advance. Every box was ticked. The gravitational wake from the drive cores, as the ship moved through the station's outer approach zone, moved through the station's structural sensors like a slow tide. The station's engineering team logged it as an event of interest. The sensors would take 2 hours to return to baseline after the ship cleared the outer marker. Berth 7 Gamma Extended ceased to exist on the official docking log. Berth 7 Gamma returned to its standard rating. 400 tons, 600 at maximum. The 14 hegemony warships were still in formation when the unconditional surrender passed through the outer perimeter. They had received their orders from Orath Min 40 minutes before the departure, and the orders had been simple. Maintain formation, no engagement, standard observation protocol. The captains had maintained the formation. They watched the ship pass. The captain of the Korath-class destroyer with the fractured port-aft shield emitter, His name was Teth, and he was a thorough man, watched the ship on his sensor display for the full duration of its transit through the outer zone, and then continued watching the screen after it had gone, looking at the space where it had been. He thought about the microfracture in his shield emitter. He had known about it for 6 weeks. He had put in the maintenance request. The request was in the queue. He had been told 3 months, standard priority. He moved the request to urgent. Then he opened a message terminal and composed a formal commendation, addressed to the Conclave Transit Authority, citing the unconditional surrender for exceptional compliance with transit protocols during a non-standard tonnage docking event. He was not certain this was the correct category for the commendation. He was not certain there was a correct category for what he had spent the last 3 days watching, but he filed it because he was a thorough man, and because something in the last 3 days felt like it deserved to be noted officially by someone. He sent it. He did not know what would happen to it. He went back to his instruments. Specialist 3rd Class Amara Okafor got off shift at 1900. She had spent the day on routine maintenance logging, the kind of work that accumulates when a ship is at dock and the normal rhythm of transit operations pauses, and the things that get deferred during active operations get undeferred. She had logged 47 items. She had flagged 3 for immediate repair and cleared the rest as within acceptable parameters. It was the kind of work that did not require much of her brain, which meant her brain had been doing other things while her hands and eyes did the work. It had been thinking about the inspection delegation and the historian who had stood in front of the war archive and asked how they had survived. It had been thinking about this in the unfocused way you think about things that don't require a conclusion. She went to the observation lounge on deck 3. It was a small room with 3 chairs and a viewport that looked out the starboard side. At dock, the starboard view was the main approach corridor, the same corridor through which the ship had arrived and through which, shortly before she sat down, it had departed. She got a sandwich from the food unit. She sat down. The news feed was running on the small display mounted in the corner of the room, as it always was, cycling through Conclave general broadcast and internal ship announcements and Republic domestic news that was 17 hours old by the time it arrived at this distance. The vote result was at the bottom of the screen. A ticker, small text. Terran Republic application for full Conclave membership. Approved. Vote, 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Motion carries. She ate her sandwich. She read the ticker. She read it again. She put the sandwich down and picked up the small personal tablet from her pocket. She opened the news feed on it. Same ticker. Different presentation. Slightly larger text. A brief summary article. Quotes from the session that she did not read. She scrolled to the vote numbers. 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Motion carries. She put the tablet face down on her knee. She looked out the viewport. The approach corridor was empty now. The station's outer perimeter lights ran in their standard sequence. Green, 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 pause, green. The way they always had. The way they would after she went to sleep and after the ship reached its next destination and after whatever came next. She picked up the tablet. Strolled past the vote result, looking for something good to watch. She found a documentary about deep ocean geology on a planet she had never heard of. She watched 3 minutes of it. It was fine. Interesting enough. She kept scrolling. A comedy series from Earth, 6 seasons, she had already seen 3 of them. A political analysis piece about the vote, already 17 minutes long and still going. A music program. She went back to the news feed. Read the ticker one more time. 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Motion carries. She put the tablet away. She finished her sandwich. She sat for a moment in the small observation lounge with the green running lights of the approach corridor moving through their sequence outside the viewport, thinking the kind of thoughts that don't organize themselves into sentences, feeling something she did not try to name, in the way that some things don't need a name to be felt. Then she stood up. She threw away the sandwich wrapper. She went to her bunk. She went to sleep. Outside, the unconditional surrender was already past the outer marker and moving at transit speed toward the jump point, its drive wake fading behind it, growing thinner, and the 14 hegemony warships in their careful formation growing smaller in its sensors, and the station growing smaller, and Velmora and its docking logs and its structural integrity alerts and its session chamber and its circular table, all growing smaller, the way things grow smaller when you leave them, when you have done the thing you came to do and now you have somewhere else to be. They had a schedule. They kept it. This was the last word on what they were.